Hello to our friends joining us via recording. Today we are working on lab lesson number 10, week 12. We are talking about the ventricles, the cranial nerves, and the parts of the arm. So to get us ready for these things today, we did some group work together. We're going to overview that group work and then move into some of that new stuff. By the way, just want to point out, some of my friends who are here in class, I already mentioned this, but Dr. Ollis is mentally on vacation this week because we are going to use a mnemonic or a phrase about going on vacation to help us learn those cranial nerves. So I'll explain my beach picture a little bit more later, but I think we can all agree that a beach vacation right about now would be pretty awesome. So we can dream about one as we're learning our cranial nerves. Before we talk about the ventricles, which are the fluid-filled spaces in various places in the brain, we need to remind ourselves about some of the connective tissues that we talked about that help to form the ventricle spaces throughout the brain. So last week we talked about what were called the meninges, which is the connective tissue that we find wrapping around the brain. One of the places in these meninges was actually filled with cerebrospinal fluid, which is the same kind of fluid that I find in the ventricles we're talking about this week. So I know I'm not going in order here, but I want to start actually at the bottom of our list. So we've got structures listed over here that we're matching up. What is the name of the space or the open area where I had cerebrospinal fluid? When we were talking last week, where did we talk about finding that CSF, the cerebrospinal fluid? Do we remember? Yeah, Kira's right. When we talk about the space or the open area where we had cerebrospinal fluid, its name kind of gives it away, right? It's called the subarachnoid space. Now, the interesting thing about its name is that tells us where we would find it. So this beginning part here, sub, means below, and that second part of its name, arachnoid, tells us which of the layers, which of the maters we're talking about. The subarachnoid space is found underneath the arachnoid mater. Now, when we talk about the arachnoid mater, remember that the maters are all the connective tissue layers. Is the arachnoid mater the one attached to the brain, attached to the skull, or the one in the middle? Do you remember which of these three the arachnoid mater is? Yeah, so we're a little rustier on this stuff, right? That's okay. When we talk about the arachnoid mater, that is the one that's in the middle. It's in the middle. Directly underneath it is that subarachnoid space that we started with, the space that's filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Now, the subarachnoid space, it's underneath the arachnoid mater, but it's also above or found kind of on top of my layer called the Pia Mater. Here's a reminder for us that the Pia Mater, its name means gentle or soft, if you will. The Pia Mater is actually the layer of the meninges that's attached directly to the brain. So the Pia Mater attaches to the brain. Right on the outside of the Pia Mater is the subarachnoid space, the fluid-filled space, particularly the space with cerebrospinal fluid. Above the subarachnoid space is the arachnoid mater. On the outside of the arachnoid mater, the spider web looking area, we also have that really thick layer called the Dura Mater. So the Dura Mater is my last layer of meninges, the one that's connected directly to the skull bones. The Dura Mater is actually so thick, it's made of two different layers of connective tissue, that there are places where it splits in half. The places where the Dura Mater splits in half are called the dural venous sinuses. the dural venous sinuses, where the Dura Mater, its layers separate from each other. The dural venous sinuses are areas that are filled with blood. So our last structure that we're mentioning here is what's called the dural venous sinus. This is the place where oxygen poor blood, the blood that's already circulated around the brain that we're done with, this is where we send it so that it can leave the head, so that it can leave the skull and go down and get oxygen again. This place, the dural venous sinus, is also going to be really important when we're talking about how we get rid of extra cerebrospinal fluid. Your body is constantly making cerebrospinal fluid, but we only have so much space inside the brain for it. So we need to have a way for us to dump that extra cerebrospinal fluid back into the bloodstream. This is where we're going to dump it when we're done with it. So we'll talk a little bit more about how we get fluid out of the subarachnoid space and into the dural venous sinus to make sure that we don't have too much of it, to make sure that that fluid can leave circulation when we're done with it. As we're talking about the cerebrospinal fluid, we're going to talk today about the ventricles, or the fluid-filled spaces in the brain. When we talk about the ventricles of the brain, they're actually found inside of or right next to each of these brain structures that we talked about last week. So we need to remind ourselves where these structures are. So when I tell you that there's a fluid-filled space in the middle of it, you have some idea of where I'm talking about. So let's talk about first the place where I find the lateral ventricles. And we'll look at these in just a moment. The lateral ventricles are the biggest cerebrospinal fluid-filled places. They are found in each of the hemispheres of the cerebrum. Each of the hemispheres of the cerebrum. Now, when we talk about the cerebrum, I know I heard us in our group work talking a little bit about this. How might you describe what the cerebrum is, or what it looks like? To someone who doesn't know what that word cerebrum means, what might you tell them? I promise they won't judge you because they won't know what it means. Okay, I like it. Temi Teo's mentioning that she would say that the cerebrum is one of those two big parts, those two big sides. Absolutely. Or Kira's saying that wrinkly part that you see. I love it. Yeah. When we talk about the cerebrum, something that we said in group work is like, this is when you think of the brain, when you don't know any better, the cerebrum is what you're thinking of as the brain. There's a lot of other parts inside it or below it that make up the anatomy brain, but to a normal person, this is what they think of as the brain. And this up here is what we would call a cerebral hemisphere, meaning it's one half of the cerebrum. That's what its name means here. So the cerebral hemispheres, I'm just going to kind of put a line on the outside of them. These whole big areas are the cerebral hemispheres. Inside each of these hemispheres, each of these halves, we have a fluid-filled space that kind of looks like a horseshoe. I've got one here in what would be my right side of the brain, and then I'd have another one in the left side of the brain over here. So the cerebral hemispheres are the location of what we call the lateral ventricles. Something you could write down for yourself, but you'll never see it on an assignment because it's not technically accurate. You could kind of think about lateral ventricles as ventricles number 1 and number 2. Technically, we don't number them. We just call them the lateral ventricles. Thinking about them as number 1 and number 2 helps us because the next ventricle is called the third ventricle, the third fluid-filled space in the brain. And the third ventricle is found in an area called the thalamus. the thalamus. And I heard us in our group work when we were talking about the thalamus. Remember the way that last time I told you to remember the thalamus is that that's my duck face. So this area inside here is the thalamus. I'll kind of put a circle-ish around it. This middle part inside here, and actually we kind of talked about this last week with visible body. The third ventricle is what you actually had to remove to say the location of the thalamus. So everywhere inside this duck face is where we'd find the third ventricle. So the third ventricle inside the thalamus, and this area that we labeled inside here is the thalamus. Pull it up a little bit, see if we can see it a little better. I did hear us mention a very important structure that I'm going to label on here. Remember, I told you last week, 100% I guarantee you're going to have to know this structure right here, the corpus callosum. That's this big light colored structure that we see right here. We will actually talk even more about this next week in lecture, the corpus callosum. But remember that this is the structure that helps me to connect my two halves of the cerebrum together. So when we talk about being right-brained or left-brained, your halves are always talking to each other. The corpus callosum allows them to talk to each other. So the corpus callosum is this structure up here. It's above the thalamus, above the duck head. The duck head, the thalamus, is where I find that third ventricle. The last ventricle that we have is called the fourth ventricle, And the fourth ventricle is kind of wedged in between our two other brain structures. So it's going to be between the cerebellum, that's the first one on our list, and the pons, the structure called the pons. When I talk about this structure right here, which one is this? Is this the pons or the cerebellum right here with that arbor vitae that we talked about last week? The arbor vitae. Yeah, so this white part underneath the cerebrum, that's the part of the brain called the cerebellum. I can't remember if I said this last week or not, but a fun fact about the cerebellum is it actually has the same number of neurons in it as the cerebrum does. So this looks so much more compact and so much more squeezed down because it is. There's a lot of extra folding that makes up the cerebellum. It's the home to just as many neurons as this whole big cerebrum is. So the cerebellum is probably underappreciated. There's actually some articles for current events talking about where there's, for example, a woman who was born without a cerebellum. So you could do a little bit of reading to find out how might your life be different if you didn't have this cerebellum, if you didn't have all of these brain structures here, or all these neurons that live here. So here's my cerebellum. On the opposite side of the brainstem from the cerebellum, over here, we have the pons. So the pons is the bump that we see on the front side of the brainstem, the pons. And the cerebellum, they're on opposite sides. If you see this open space right here, this is the location of the fourth ventricle. So I'll draw a little line for us. This open space that we see right here, that's where I find the fourth ventricle. So in between the pons and the cerebellum, that's the fourth ventricle. All up inside here, inside that duck face, that's where the third ventricle would be found. And then a horseshoe looking structure that's here in the middle of each of my cerebral hemispheres, those would be the two lateral ventricles. How do we feel about our brain structures and about the ventricles in general? Thumbs up, thumbs down. Hopefully we're not already mind blown. It's a little early in class today to be mind blown. Coming soon, but not quite yet. Perfect. Okay. Well, let's look at the last group work activity that we did together. That'll gear us up for the end of our class today. In addition to our brain stuff, we are also talking about the arm and studying the arm this week. So just like we did with the leg, I made a list for us of several of the joints that we have in the arm. Some of these, the ones that I pulled from our list here, are the ones that I can use clues in their name to help me figure out where I find those joints. Before we go through and identify the specific locations of the joints, let's take a moment and we're actually going to label our bones. Now, we said when we were doing the group work that we don't like the left arm, but my little left-handed daughter would be like, hey, that's not cool. So we're going to label our left arm together. We can do all the joints on the right arm for all of us right-handed people. But do I have any lefties in class today? My daughter is left-handed, so I'm learning. She's 4, so I'm learning how left-handed people hold a pencil, and that is blowing my mind. That's what's blowing my mind these days, trying to figure out how to show her how to hold a pencil on her little preschool homework. So, okay, yeah, Kaylin has a son who's a lefty as well. Yeah, so that's great. Let's work together. We're going to label our bones here in the left arm to make sure we remember where everybody is. So let's start up here with the big bone that we find up here in our arm. I think we should all know this one up here. What's that biggest bone that we find in the arm, in the upper part of the arm? Yeah, exactly. Kira's right. That big bone up there is called the humerus. Yep, the funny bone. Not so funny when we hit it, but the funny bone, right? So we got the humerus up there. Below the humerus, we've got 2 bones in your forearm. Remember, these are bones that it's important that we know lateral versus medial. Remind me in the chat again, that word lateral. What does lateral mean? Lateral. It's been a while since we talked about that. Yeah, I like it. So we're saying things like on the outside or away from the middle. Absolutely. So in the forearm, we've got a lateral bone and we've got a medial bone. Who lives on the lateral side? Or basically, who lives on the thumb side? Who's lateral down here? Exactly. Yep. The radius is the lateral bone. It's always the bone on the outside, the one that's on the thumb side, which means that on the pinky side, or the medial side, we've got the ulna. So we've got the radius and the ulna that we find in the forearm. Then we go down into the wrist bones. The wrist bones as a group have a name. It's the same name as the wrist region. What's the name of this group of bones? My big group together. Yeah, exactly. So the group of bones in your wrists are called the carpals. Alas, the week has come where we cannot just call them the carpals. Today we have to actually learn their specific names. So by the end of this week, you will know the name of each of the carpals here. Make sure to look at that phrase that was included in the guided lesson to help you out with knowing their names and locations. And if we have time today, hopefully we can go through and name each of them as well. So we've got the radius and the ulna and the forearm. We go down into the carpals that are in the wrist. Then we go to the 5 bones that make up the palm of your hand. Now remember, when we talk about these bones that make up the palm of your hand, the way I like to remember their name is that they're touching the carpals. What was the name of the bones right here that are touching or meet up with the carpals? Yeah, exactly. The bones in the palm of your hands are called the metacarpals. Metacarpals. Let's move that. So the metacarpals make up the palm of your hand. They meet with the carpals in your wrist. And then, of course, we've got all of our finger bones. Those finger bones out here for each of your fingers, those are bones called phalanges. Phalanges. So we've gone through and named, big picture, all of the bones that we see in the arm. What I'll mention here about the metacarpals, really fast, each of the metacarpals have their own name, but it's really easy to know their names. The metacarpals just are called metacarpal number, and then we start counting over here on the thumb. So number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, and number 5. So metacarpals, all you got to know is their number. We always start on the thumb side and then count toward the pinky side. Metacarpal number 3, metacarpal number 5. So make sure we know what number they are. With the phalanges, each of these finger bones also has their own name. They have a number at the end of it. So these are our phalanx that end with number 1, number 2, 3, 4, and 5. When we talk about the phalanges, there are typically 3 of them. So the first finger bone, which is the one that you would put a ring on, for example, if we were talking about right here, we would call this the proximal phalanx. Then the one that's next to it, so the part of your finger that's just above where a ring goes, that would be called the middle. And the very end where you'd find your fingernails, that's called the distal. So this is proximal phalanx, number 4, middle phalanx, number 4, and distal phalanx, number 4. The thumb is special. It's a shorter joint because it does not have a middle phalanx in it. So when you're naming the bones in the thumb are either proximal phalanx, number 1, or distal phalanx, number 1. So the good news is we're learning a lot of bone names this week, but a bunch of those bone names that we're learning, as long as we remember proximal, middle, and distal, or remember our numbers, we should be good. We don't have to know anything in particular. We just got to know those special names of all these little carpals here in the middle. Caitlin's asking about the numbering of the phalanges. I'm not sure what you mean by opposite, but we do always start on the thumb. So number 1 it's metacarpal number 1, and then the phalanges, number 1 through 5. So everything in the hand, we're always referring back to the thumb as number 1. Yeah, so exactly. The numbering system is the same. Whether you're the metacarpal that goes to the thumb or whether you're the phalanges that make up the thumb, that's always number 1. So we're always going from lateral over to medial. Absolutely. Yeah, perfect. Okay, so now that we have named all of these different bones, we're now going to go through and we're going to find these joints that are named based on the bones that make them up. So we start up here with the Metacarpal joint. Can you tell me in the chat in general, where in the body might you describe where the Metacarpal joint would be? Can you give me a general idea of where I'm looking, even if it's not perfect? Yeah, so kind of by the wrist. I like that. So Metacarpal, its name tells me, the first half tells me we're by the carpals. Second half tells me we're by the metacarpals. So I find my carpal bones that are right here. I see my metacarpal bones that are right here. The Metacarpal joint is this line right here. So let me grab my pen. The place where those carpal bones interact with the metacarpals, that's my Metacarpal joint. Perfect. Next joint that we have on our list here, Humeroradial Joint. Humeroradial joint. Help me out in the chat. What 2 bones am I going to find at the Humeroradial joint? What 2 bones do we find at the Humeroradial joint? Yeah, I'm making you type a lot today, aren't I? So sorry. Humeral for the humerus, radial for the radius. So we look at our picture here. Here's my humerus. And remember that the radius is always on the lateral side. So the humeroradial joint, I can see it right here between the radius and the humerus. Or if I come over here to the arm, the humerus, and remember the radius is on the lateral side. So here's my humeroradial joint. Let's color that one in. Humeroradial joint. Hey, next one on my list is humerolnar joint. So it's still a joint that involves the humerus. What other bone does the humerolnar joint have in it? Yeah, I know that Dr. Ollis is pretty tricky, right? A lot of times Dr. Ollis asks trick questions, but this is not a trick question. The humerolnar joint is the joint between the humerus and the ulna. So right next door to the humeroradial joint is the humerolnar joint. We can see them right next to each other. Perfect. All right, let's look at our next one on the list. This is called the intercarpal joint. The intercarpal joint. The intercarpal joint is found in between the carpal bones. In between the carpal bones. So the intercarpal joint is going to really be some of the major joints that we find in the wrist. I'm going to do my best to kind of try to draw little lines in here. Any of the places in between the carpals where the bones in the wrist meet each other, the places where they meet each other and kind of slide past, those are the places called the intercarpal joints. The intercarpal joints, where the bones of the wrist slide past each other. Remind me, in your packet, do we ask you to group together joints by places like the elbow and the wrist and the knuckles? Okay, perfect. We're saying yes. Yeah. So hopefully you can see as we're going through and identifying these bones on the or these joints on the skeleton, there's actually a lot of different joints that come together at the wrist, and a lot of different joints that we find here in the elbow as well. So that's part of why we're looking at these on a skeleton and finding them, is to help us get a visual reference for the fact that there's a lot of joints at various places in your body that move a whole lot. Lots of different joints that come together there. All right, next joint on my list is the interphalangeal joint. Interphalangeal joint. Can you tell me in easy person words, where am I going to find the interphalangeal joints? What would you tell a normal person, not an anatomy weirdo like Dr. Ollis? Yeah, so Kira is speaking Dr. Ollis language, right? It is in between the phalanges, absolutely. So between those finger bones, yeah, so we could call those, like Timoteo mentioned, this would be our knuckle joints. So the knuckle joints, and maybe we'll qualify that by saying the knuckle joints that you find in the fingers, right? So my interphalangeal joints will start with the ones that are between the distal phalanx and the middle phalanx. This is an interphalangeal joint. Now we've got the middle phalanx and the proximal phalanx. All of these joints that we see right here and there as well, all of these joints that we see here are also interphalangeal joints. Why is this not an interphalangeal joint? Can anyone help me out? Why is this one not an interphalangeal joint? Yeah, exactly. Kira is mentioning that we also bump into at this joint right here. We actually bump into the metacarpal bones. Remember those ones that make up the palm of your hand? These joints right here are my next joint on the list. the metacarpophalangeal joints between the metacarpals and the phalanges. So these bones here are the metacarpals. When they touch the phalanges, it's not in between two phalanges, it's in between a metacarpal and a phalanx, or between the phalanges. So this joint here that you might call the knuckles that are actually like on your hands, right? So when you ball your hands up, those knuckles that stick up on the back of your hand, that's the metacarpophalangeal joints. The knuckles on your fingers and your one knuckle that's on the thumb itself, those are the interphalangeal joints. Again, the name tells us what bones we're between. So since we're between different kinds of bones right here than we are up here, that's why we've got a different name. My last two joints are both between the same bones, the radius for radio and the ulna for ulnar. We've got the distal and the proximal radio-ulnar joints. Now here's a reminder for us. When we are talking about two structures, in this case two joints, that are both on the same limb, so they're both on the same arm, when we compare them, we're using distal and proximal. So I've got two places where the radius and the ulna meet. I've got one here, and I've got one right here. When I talk about this joint right here, where the radius and the ulna meet, would this one be proximal or distal? The proximal or the distal radio-ulnar joint, this one right here, color it in red. Yeah, so this one is my proximal radio-ulnar joint. Let's remind ourselves, when I use this word proximal, that means it's in closer proximity to the place where the limb attaches. So the proximal radio-ulnar joint is closer to the shoulder than the distal radio-ulnar joint. This one's farther away from the shoulder than this one is. So my proximal radio-ulnar joint, Timoteo is completely right. We would say that this is another one of those joints that I find by the elbow, the proximal radio-ulnar joint. Down here, my distal radio-ulnar joint, I would not say that this one is part of the elbow. What would I say that this one is part of? When we're talking about our groupings of joints, where would we describe this one as being found or being close to? Yeah, exactly. This would be another one of those joints that we include in our wrist list because it's found at the bottom part where the radius and the ulna interact with each other, right by those intercarpal joints, right by those metacarpal, carpometacarpal joints. All of those make up my wrist. And then remember, we've got our metacarpophalangeal and interphalangeal joints, making up all your types of knuckles, and then several joints that make up the elbow as well. Now that we've talked about joint locations, bone names, reviewed some of that stuff, how do we feel about this content? Thumbs up, thumbs down, questions that we still have? Several thumbs up. Perfect. Okay, well, as a reminder, when you're working on the bones, remember, we're learning so much in lab each week, right? The more that you can think your way through stuff, the better off you'll be. So these joints, 100% you can think your way through. As long as you know the names of your bones, and as long as you know where those bones are, you can think your way through locations. So make a plan with these joint names. We're just going to use their names to figure out where we find them. And then we don't have to spend too much study time going through and memorizing their exact locations. I want to remind us of the model that we looked at last week. As we're getting ready to talk about the ventricles of the brain, or to look at them on a picture, let's say, when we talk about the ventricles, the fluid-filled spaces in the brain, we are making fluid all the time, but we don't want to keep that fluid in the ventricles all the time. Remember, I told you that we drain our cerebrospinal fluid into the sinus, the dural venous sinus, to get rid of it. We already labeled last week that this area here was that dural venous sinus, usually filled with blood. So I'll put some blood up here. This is our blood-filled space, the dural venous sinus. Remember, I'm going to put some cerebrospinal fluid in the subarachnoid space. So I made it blue here. We've got cerebrospinal fluid here. This cerebrospinal fluid that is here in the subarachnoid space actually came from the ventricles. When it was done circulating in the brain, it goes outside the brain, because once it's outside the brain, I can get it back into the bloodstream using our one structure that's new this week. See this bump right here? This bump where the arachnoid mater sticks out. This thing here is what we call an arachnoid granulation, or sometimes you'll see these called arachnoid villi. It's the same deal. So an arachnoid granulation or an arachnoid villus, that's these balloons that you see here. They're filled with the cerebrospinal fluid that was outside the brain. This is a passageway. When cerebrospinal fluid comes in here, it goes into the dural venous sinus and it goes away from the brain. So the only new thing on this model this week are these arachnoid granulations. Super, super important because they allow us to recycle cerebrospinal fluid. Once it goes around the brain and we're getting rid of it, we're getting rid of it through these arachnoid villi or the arachnoid granulations back into the bloodstream. So refer back to last week's packet for labeling everything else. We labeled everything that's on this list except for the arachnoid granulations. That's the only new thing, and it's right here, this little bubble that we see right here. What I want to focus on are this couple of pictures that you have in your packet that show you the ventricles. Can you tell me what page we're on with these pictures of the ventricles here? Where do you find this in your packet? Perfect. Okay, we're on page 2. This is showing us the ventricles in 2 different views. So if you were to be able to stare through me on the camera, I'm facing you head on. If we were to look at my ventricles from the front when you're staring at me, we can see them in this view. So here's the front of your head and the back of your head's back over here. This is an anterior view. When we're looking over here, this is the lateral view, which is like what we looked at together at the beginning in our group work when we were labeling the brain parts. So we're going to label these ventricles in both views, the anterior view and the lateral view. Keep in mind they're exactly the same, it's just 2 different ways to look at them. Let's start at the beginning. The beginning are structures that we call the lateral ventricles. Now remember, the lateral ventricles, I actually have 2 of them. The lateral ventricles are this horseshoe-shaped thing that we see right here. These were the ones that I told you we found inside the cerebral hemispheres. Actually, I'm just going to type. Let me type on top of them. Lateral ventricle. The lateral ventricles are the horseshoe-shaped ones. There is 1 in each hemisphere. So when we look from the side, you can see the one in the front and you can see the one in the back. When we come over to the anterior view, you can see how these 2 ventricles stick out more laterally. They're the most toward the outside. So the reason I call these 2 the lateral ventricles is because they're on the outside. So let me label them on my other picture as well. Lateral ventricle. I've got 1 in each of my hemispheres of the brain, the two lateral ventricles. Then we go down into the duck face. This looks a lot like that thalamus structure that we labeled last week, right? And we looked at this actually in visible body, cutting this away. This right here is that third ventricle. So the third ventricle, when we're looking at it by itself, looks a lot like that duck face that we were talking about, that we labeled as the thalamus. So the third ventricle there in the middle. When we look at it from the side, the third ventricle is a little bit harder to see. It's actually very skinny. So the third ventricle is up here when we're looking at it from the side. This little skinny section here. Or when you look at it over here, you can see the whole duck face. It fills up that whole thalamus. The fourth ventricle is the one that I told you was between the pons and the cerebellum. So notice this square that I kind of see right there. That is my fourth ventricle. We'll label that one fourth ventricle. And that one we can actually see pretty well in both of our views. The fourth ventricle looks pretty large in this view as well, the fourth ventricle. I guess I'll move that third ventricle label so we don't confuse ourselves. Lateral ventricles, third ventricle, and then that fourth ventricle. So 1 and 2, essentially, up top, 3 and 4. Or if we go from the side, 1 and 2, 3 and 4. In addition to knowing where the ventricles are, we also need to know the tubes, the names of the tubes that connect these ventricles to each other. So we've got two tubes. One of them is called the Cerebral Aqueduct, and one of them is called the Interventricular Foramen. The one that is easiest to see is the Cerebral Aqueduct. So the Cerebral Aqueduct, see this tube right here that goes between the third ventricle and the fourth ventricle. This long tube that kind of looks like a neck or something like that. This long tube is that cerebral aqueduct. The cerebral aqueduct connects the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle. It's this tube that we see here. Now, the interventricular foramen is a little bit trickier to see. I'm going to move my label. The interventricular foramen, you can kind of see it right here. See how there's like a little projection off my duck head up here? That's my interventricular foramen. So let me type that big long label. Interventricular foramen. Oop, I spelled that wrong. Ignore it. Interventricular foramen, that little tube there. Honestly, we really can't see it here. It would be in between these ventricles going into the third ventricle. So you can only kind of see it. It's right here. The interventricular foramen helps us take fluid from the lateral ventricle into the third ventricle. That's the job of the interventricular foramen. The cerebral aqueduct takes fluid from the third ventricle down into the fourth ventricle. When we're done with this cerebrospinal fluid, so it's gone all the way through all these ventricles, we will either send that fluid down into the middle of the spinal cord. Here's a term that we will see, I think it's next week actually, when we start talking about the spinal cord. When fluid leaves the fourth ventricle and goes into the spinal cord, it's going into a tube that we see here called the central canal. So you don't have to know that this week, but next week we'll know that the central canal is one of the places where the fourth ventricle will dump out its cerebrospinal fluid. The other place that the ventricles will dump out their fluid is back into the subarachnoid space. The subarachnoid space. So see how I've got these two little points on my ventricle right here? You can kind of see little points right here. These are spaces where I can dump that cerebrospinal fluid into the subarachnoid space. Because once it's in the subarachnoid space, I can use the arachnoid granulations to dump that fluid it back into the bloodstream. Something we will talk about in lecture, but not in lab, is a condition where we have too much cerebrospinal fluid, where we're not draining it out of the ventricles. That's a condition called hydrocephalus. Hydrocephalus. Its name literally means water on the brain. It's not actually a water problem. It's a problem with cerebrospinal fluid. So I'm constantly making cerebrospinal fluid inside each of these ventricles. I'm using a thing that I'm pretty sure you have to label this week, or at least know about, called the choroid plexus. This is where I make cerebrospinal fluid. They're constantly making cerebrospinal fluid. We're constantly putting it into these ventricles. When we put it into the ventricles, we need to be able to drain it. Otherwise, these ventricles will expand and put pressure on parts of the brain. So hydrocephalus is what happens when we can't drain that cerebrospinal fluid and we have too much of it inside the ventricles. Before we move on to cranial nerves, any questions about the ventricles, the fluid-filled spaces of the brain? I feel like I have talked entirely too much. We need to have some emojis. Can you send me some emojis? Let me find you some emojis too. I'm going to send you a fox because I decorated my son's nursery with foxes. And let's see if I can find, here we go, the beach. I like it. I got an alien, I got a monkey. Oh, Edith sent me a hug. That's so sweet. I love it. I'm not sure if you can hear it in my voice. I can hear it. My littlest, the 10-month-old, he went to school for 2 days and he caught a cold already after 2 days. And he shared that cold with mommy and daddy. So I'm almost better, but my voice is a little bit weird today. So I appreciate the hug. I appreciate the love, Audrey. Thank you. We knew that he was going to get sick when we went to school. Did not know it was just going to take 2 days. So that was a little bit of a shock, but we're making it through. All right. Well, we've talked about the fluid-filled spaces. We've talked about the ventricles. We are now going to go to the outside of the brain, and we are going to talk about what are called the cranial nerves. The cranial nerves. Now, remind me, is this the picture you have in your lab packet, or do you have a different picture in your lab packet? I can't remember if we updated it or not. Is this the same one, or is there a different one? Okay, we've got a different one. Good. Let me see if I can pull it up really fast if I remember which one we have. I think we gave you one that is color-coded. Is that right? Maybe? No, it's not color-coded. Okay, it's just different. Bear with me. I'm going to look for... We'll do. I'm going to label the cranial nerves on this one. This model is one that everyone hates. So if we can find them on this really terrible model, that'll give me time too to download your version of this worksheet so that I can write on it together. So let me get that download started really fast. Apologies. Dr. Ollis came to class not quite prepared. As we are downloading, do me a favor and pull out a piece of paper that's blank, or find a space, a piece of paper that has a lot of space on it, because we are going to do two different things. Let me download. We're going to draw a clown face to help us remember what our cranial nerves do. And we're also going to use my beach vacation thing to help us out. Oh, look at that. Okay. I found your picture. Excellent. I finally got it. So let me show you really fast. I wonder if it will let me. Not sure if it's going to let me write on it or not. Okay, well, I'm going to share my screen with you, and I'll go through and show you where each of the cranial nerves are. I won't be able to write on it since it's not here in Collaborate with us, but we'll still be able to look at things together. So let me give it a moment to share with you. Can you all see it? Perfect. Okay, so when we are working on cranial nerves, let's start right now, mainly focusing on their numbers. And I'll tell you their names. You've got their names listed on the previous page, so don't worry too much about the names right now. Right now, I want to make sure we write down the numbers. So when we're talking about the cranial nerves, they are numbered from front, anterior, to back, posterior. And if there's a bunch in the same region, you start medial and work lateral. So let's go through. We'll start in the very front and work our way back and go medial to lateral to name our cranial nerves. Up here at the very front, this is cranial nerve number 1. By the way, the cranial nerves come in pairs. There's always 2 of them. So cranial nerve number 1 on the left and the right side. This cranial nerve is called the olfactory nerve. Do we know yet? The olfactory nerve, what does that nerve help us to do? The olfactory nerve. Yeah, so Kira's right. Olfactory helps us with olfaction. That's the sense of smell. So cranial nerve number 1, up toward the very front of the brain. This one helps you to smell. We work our way back down to see this little X. So see this X structure that we see right here? This is cranial nerve number 2, called the optic nerve. So these are the 2 branches of cranial nerve number 2. Cranial nerve number 2, the optic nerve, the best way for you to identify it is because of this X. So this X is called the optic chiasm. The stuff that your right eye sees actually goes to the left side of your brain. And the stuff that your left eye sees goes to the right side of your brain. So this is the place where the information crisscrosses to go back to the other part of the brain. So the optic chiasm, this X, that helps you to find cranial nerve number 2, the optic nerve. Working our way down, here's our next cranial nerves that we see right here. This is cranial nerve number 3. Cranial nerve number 3 is called the oculomotor nerve. The oculomotor nerve. This is one of many nerves that helps you to move your eyeball. So cranial nerve number 3, oculomotor, helping you to move the eye, eye, motor, movement. This works together with this little tiny cranial nerve you see right here, and we actually see it over here as well. This is cranial nerve number 4, called the trochlear nerve. That's another one that helps us to move our eyeball, the trochlear nerve, number 4. The other one that helps us move the eyeball, we're going to skip for a moment, is this one right here. This one right here is number 6. Cranial nerve number 6 is the abducens nerve. And the abducens nerve helps us to abduct the eyeball. So one more movement of the eyeball, the abducens nerve, number 6, this one right here in the middle. Let's go back to this one that we skipped right here. This big one that we skipped right here is number 5. Cranial nerve number 5 is the biggest cranial nerve. So cranial nerve number 5 is called the trigeminal nerve. Tri means 3. So I've got 1, 2, and 3 branches, and 1, 2, and 3 branches, trigeminal. That's this big nerve here. This one's going out to your face. It's going to help you out with chewing, help you feel stuff by your teeth. Lots of different things that the trigeminal nerve does right here. So there's number 5. We already talked about number 6, right here, so the oculomotor nerve. Now we go down to the side. Number 7 is this cranial nerve on top, cranial nerve number 7. Cranial nerve number 7 is the facial nerve. This one helps us with facial expressions and collecting information from our face. Next door, we've got a nerve that kind of has 2 parts to it. So see these little 2 parts over here. This is cranial nerve number 8. Cranial nerve number 8 is called the Vestibulocochlear Nerve. Vestibulocochlear Nerve. And this one goes to your ears. So it's going to help you, the vestibule part of its name helps you to balance. The cochlear part of its name helps you to hear. So the vestibulocochlear nerve number 8 that we see out here. Then we go down next door to this little one that you see right here. That's number 9. Cranial nerve number 9. Let's see where we're at. This is the, 10 accessory. Uh-oh, Dr. Alice needs to write down her phrase. Oh, we forgot. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. What are we on? We're on number 9. Yeah, glossopharyngeal. Thank you. I forgot where we were at. Look at that. I apologize. So cranial nerve number 9 down here. This is called the glossopharyngeal nerve. Cranial nerve number 9 goes to, glosso means tongue. Pharyngeal means pharynx or throat. So cranial nerve number 9 goes to your throat and it goes to your tongue. Helps you to taste a little bit, helps you to talk, glossopharyngeal. Cranial nerve number 10, right next door. See this big one right here. Cranial nerve number 10 is called the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve, if you've ever heard of a vagrant, that's someone who kind of wanders around. The vagus nerve is a wandering nerve. It goes all over in the body. So it's going to go down all the way to your organs in your abdominal pelvic tract area. So the vagus nerve, whole lot of different things, sensory and motor things. Number 10, this big one right here. Then we go down here. See this nice long line that you see right here? This is cranial nerve number 11, this long one down here. Cranial nerve number 11 is called the accessory nerve. This controls some of the muscles in your neck, kind of in the same place where you would wear an accessory, like a scarf. So cranial nerve number 11 down here. And then we get a little bit funky, and we go back up here for cranial nerve number 12. So cranial nerve number 12 is this little one here in the middle. Fun fact, as close as we come to a controversy in anatomy, is whether or not we should actually consider cranial nerve number 11 a cranial nerve, because it actually is more attached to the spinal cord. So hot debate in the anatomy community as to whether or not number 11 is a cranial nerve. For the sake of our class, yes, it is a cranial nerve. Sometimes you'll see it called the spinal accessory nerve because of that debate. So if you're ever reading this week or as you get ready for the final exam and you see that terminology, the spinal accessory nerve, yeah, like here, put in the chat, dun dun dun, the plot is thickening. So we debate whether or not the accessory nerve is a cranial nerve. Back up here, number 12 though, this is called the hypoglossal nerve. No debate about this one right here. This is definitely a cranial nerve. So really fast, let's run through our numbering to make sure we caught them all. We got number 1 up here, the olfactory nerve. Number 2, the optic nerve with that crisscross. Number 3, on top of, here's the pons, by the way. So to give you a frame of reference, we're just above the pons. That's number 3, the oculomotor nerve. Little tiny number 4, the trochlear nerve. Our really big number 5, the trigeminal nerve. We come down to number 6 down here in the middle. Now, by the way, we're between the pons and the medulla oblongata. Number 6 right here. We've got number 7 right next to it. The 2 branches of number 8. 2 branches of number 8. Then we've got our skinny number 9, skinny number 9, number 10, and then that controversial number 11 that goes down here, back up to number 12. That's the locations of those cranial nerves. Before I move on, any questions about locations? We will come back and talk about functions, so don't worry too much about that at the moment. Okay, we're feeling okay with the locations. Perfect. Let's get a blank whiteboard here, and we're going to work on, let's do names first, and then we will do we'll do functions with our crazy clown. Cranial nerve number 4. That's the little tiny one, Audrey. So if you see that big one that has the 3 branches on it called the trigeminal, there's a little tiny line that comes up next to that big 3-branch one, and that's called the trochlear nerve. So you can see number 3 in the very middle. You can see that really huge number 5 on the 2 edges. And then there's that little tiny number 4 that's hidden in between. Number 4 actually comes from the back side of the brainstem. So that's another fun fact about it. It's the smallest, and it also wraps around from the back side toward the front. So cranial nerve number 4. All right, let's talk about how a vacation after anatomy class is done is going to help us to remember the names of our cranial nerves. So here's my phrase. I'm going to do a lot of typing. Bear with me. Here we go. Oh, once one takes the anatomy final, very good vacations are happening. Oh, once one takes the anatomy final, very good vacations are happening. Anybody have any vacations planned after that anatomy final? Any takers? I usually don't, but this is one of the first semesters that I do. Yeah, I got a couple of people that are saying yes. We are going to drive down to Corpus Christi, and I'm going to take my son to the beach for the first time. So I am looking forward to that once the anatomy final is done. Oh, Chris is moving. Yeah, I don't know how to change good vacations to something related to moving. Maybe you can come up with something that would work. Oh, Barbara's going to Dubai. Nice. That'll be awesome. Audrey's moving too. Yeah, so either you're taking a vacation or you're moving, or you're staying at home. That's usually what I do. Kaylin's staying home and taking algebra. I feel for you, Kaylin. I know how that goes. Okay, well, let's pretend that we are taking vacations after we take the anatomy final, because this phrase gives me the first letter of the name of all of my cranial nerves that we just talked about. So my first cranial nerve number 1, was called the olfactory nerve. That's O in my phrase. Cranial nerve number 2 was called the optic nerve. That's once. Cranial nerve number 3 was called the oculomotor nerve. 1. O, once, 1. We're through our first set of them. Cranial nerve number 4 was called the trochlear nerve. That's when we take that anatomy final, trochlear nerve. Number 5 was the trigeminal nerve, number 5. Number 6 was abducens. Then we went to the facial nerve, number 7. My lines here. Number 8, vestibulocochlear nerve. Oops. I always spell this one wrong, so bear with me. I probably spelled it wrong. Vestibulocochlear. Then we had the Glossopharyngeal nerve, number 9. good vacations, glossopharyngeal. Vacations, that was number 10, the vagus. See, that kind of works. You, for my friends who are moving, you're vacating your old house, right? I don't know if that helps. Vacating things. Now we're up to number 11. Number 11 was the accessory nerve. And number 12 is the hypoglossal nerve. So if this helps you to remember at least the first letter of their names, I know we've got lots of repeats, right? But if you can at least remember the first letter, and then maybe we can kind of pair that with functions, maybe that'll help you to remember the order of the cranial nerves. So O, once one takes the anatomy final, very good vacations are happening. And if you're feeling bad about not taking a vacation and you want a different mnemonic, go online and do a Google search. There are so many. This is just my favorite, especially as we're coming on to the summer season. Surely at some point we can take some kind of vacation, even if it's just a mental vacation, right? So this is the one that I like to use when I'm trying to remember the names of those cranial nerves. So find something that works for you. Make sure we know the first letter, at least, to help us get to the full name of these cranial nerves. Yeah, Kaylin says she's gonna be in her backyard in May. I like it. Perfect. All right, so there's my phrase that I use to remember the cranial nerves, to remember their names. Now we're gonna work together to draw a creepy clown to help us remember what those cranial nerves do. So hopefully you've got a blank piece of paper or got some space somewhere. I'm going to clear my whiteboard. We are going to break out a creepy clown together. So to start us off here, draw yourself a circle. That's going to be our clown's head. Here's my clown's head. For now, what we're going to do is we're going to put 2 number 1s with a circle for where the eyes are. And we're going to give our clown a little bow tie to begin. Go ahead and put a little number 11 in that bow tie. We are going to do cranial nerves on our clown face. And remember, when you take that lab exam, if you want to draw yourself a clown face, I'm totally fine with that on your blank piece of paper. Remember, you have to show me at the beginning of the exam that it's blank and rip it up at the end of the exam. But if you want to draw yourself a clown face, go for it. Cranial nerve number 1. Oh, Dr. Ollis loses. Who can tell me why Dr. Ollis loses? Dr. Ollis has not drank enough coffee today. We got to start over. I made a mistake. Yeah, olfactory is number 1. Olfactory is smell. Oh, Dr. Ollis. Okay, let's try again. Erasure number 1s. My apologies. My coffee has not kicked in. Afternoon coffee. Let's try again. He gets a 1 in the middle of his face because olfactory is number 1. Yeah, blame it on my cold, right? I can't smell, so actually I can. That's not true. But okay, we need to give him 2s for eyes. I apologize. The number 1 went for his nose. The number 2 goes for his eyes. Okay, so our clown should actually look like this. I apologize. I told you to put the wrong numbers. Okay, cranial nerve number 1. Let's do some typing here. Number 1 was the olfactory nerve, and the olfactory nerve helps you out with the process of smell. So we put a 1 here in the middle of our clown's face. This helps him with the process of smell. I'll mention that when you do some looking online, you will see that cranial nerve number 1 is what we call a sensory nerve. So I'm gonna use red for my sensory neurons here, or my sensory nerves. So all that this nerve does is the sense of smell. It's a sensory nerve. Cranial nerve number 2 is the one that actually belonged in the eyes. Cranial nerve number 2 is the optic nerve. This helps us with the sense of vision. Okay, cranial nerve number 2 is also a sensory nerve. So our clown just got creepy. You can either fill in his eyes with your sensory color, or we can just, you know, leave it, write a number 2 that's creepy. Cranial nerve number 2, another sensory nerve, helps us with the sense of vision. Next, we're going to do some nerves in a group because they all do the same thing. So cranial nerve number 3 was called the oculomotor nerve. Number 4 was the trochlear nerve. And number 6 was the abducens nerve, All 3 of these nerves do eyeball movements, and eyeball movement, okay? All of these are going to go next to our eyeball. So we're going to put number 3 on top of the eyeball, kind of like eyelashes. We're going to put number 4 on the side of the eyeball, the trochlear nerve, at an angle, and then number 6 all the way on the side. If we were a little bit more particular, which we're not, if we were really particular, we would tell you the names of the muscles that each of these control. So for example, cranial nerve number 3 controls a muscle called the superior rectus muscle. It lives on top of the eyeball. I'm not going to make you know in particular that it controls the muscle on top of the eyeball. The trochlear nerve, the reason it's here at an angle on the side is it controls the superior oblique muscle at an angle. So we put it up here on the top. And then number 6 helps us with abduction. The way that you abduct your eyeball is using your lateral rectus muscle. I don't care if you know exactly what order these little cranial nerves go in over here. That's really not important to me. But knowing that all 3 of these help with moving the eyeball, that's very important. Kaylin did mention, she's absolutely right, we should probably make a note for ourselves. One of these 3 cranial nerves also helps us to change the size of the pupil. Do we know yet who sends messages into the eyeball too? Did we make you know that on your handout? Let me scroll down to my handout and see. Yeah, so we listed it for you. It's not in bold, so it's not as important. Yeah, but cranial nerve number 3 also sends messages inside the eyeball. Primarily know about 3, 4, and 6 that they control outside the eyeball. But if you see a question on the homework that also moves the eyeball and controls the pupil, that's cranial nerve number 3. That also goes inside. All 3 of these, by the way, we would consider these ones motor. So I'll just put a note next to them. They are motor nerves. They're all about movement. So if we wanted to be technical, we'll go back here and I'll put some blue over these guys. These ones are motor nerves. They're all about, in this case, moving the eyeball. So here's my eyeball movement, eyelashes and the like on my creepy clown that I see over here. Cranial nerve number 3, 4, and 6. Cranial nerve number 5 is not feeling the love. We keep skipping it to go to number 6. So let's add it to our list. Cranial nerve number 5 is the trigeminal nerve. And when you think about the trigeminal nerve, big picture, I want you to think face. Now, I know there's more to it, and you've got specifically listed in your packet all the specific things that the trigeminal nerve does. But big picture, I want you to be thinking face. On our creepy clown here, where we're going to put number 5, is kind of over in the cheek. So make yourself a big number 5 over in kind of where the edges of the smile would be. Cranial nerve number 5 in the cheeks. This one is what we call a mixed nerve, and you'll see this in the packet when you're working on learning its functions. It has sensory functions and motor functions. So we're going to put cranial nerve number 5. I'm going to color over my 5 in green. This is a mixed nerve. So it does sensory information from your face, a little bit from your scalp, some of it from your teeth. If you're trying to think about where the trigeminal nerve actually gets information from, if you take your 3 middle fingers, so you're holding up the number 3 by holding down your pinky and your thumb together. If you spread those fingers out as wide as you can, and then put them right next to the edge of your mandible. And so we're stretching one that goes up toward your hair, one that kind of goes across your maxilla, and one that goes across the bottom of your mandible. That's the 3 places that the trigeminal nerve goes to. So it has 3 branches. If you make that number 3 with your fingers, put it at the very corner of your mandible and see where those fingers go. That's the 3 different places that the trigeminal nerve collects information from. It's also involved in helping you chew. That's why we call it a mixed nerve. It does sensory information, does motor information. It's considered mixed. Cranial nerve number 7 is also that way. So cranial nerve number 7 is the facial nerve. Facial nerve. Cranial nerve number 7, when you think about facial, really think about facial expressions. That's kind of the big one. You've also got this nerve involved in the sense of taste. So it's all about your face. We're going to put our number 7 kind of in a similar place to where our number 5 was. So this one, when we give our clown a smile, if we want to add a smile later, this will actually be kind of the edges of our smile. Cranial nerve number 7 is also a mixed nerve, so I'm going to make it green as well. Sensory and motor stuff, helping you out with facial expressions, helping you out with taste, those kind of things. Cranial nerve number 7. Cranial nerve number 8 is the vestibulocochlear nerve. Vestibulocochlear. And this is the cranial nerve that helps you with hearing and balance. Hearing and balance. So cranial nerve number 8, we are going to add some number 8 ears to our clown. Number 8 ears to our clown, because you do hearing and balance in your ears. We'll talk about that in our last lab and last lecture discussions. Cranial nerve number 8, the vestibulocochlear nerve. This is another example of a sensory nerve. So our clown's got red ears. No wonder our clown is creepy, right? He's got red ears, red eyes, and a red nose. Cranial nerve number 8, sensory nerve. Sensory nerve. Oh, I should go back. I'll mention on the facial, that's another mixed nerve. Okay. Now we're up to cranial nerve number 9. Cranial nerve number 9 is called the Glossopharyngeal nerve. Number 9. Glossopharyngeal nerve. This one, remember, its name means tongue and throat, glossopharyngeal. So when you're looking at your list of functions, it talks about the tongue and the pharynx. That's the muscles it controls. It also helps with taste. So I'm just going to put tongue throat because that's what its name literally means, the tongue throat cranial nerve. We're going to use this one to represent the mouth of our clown. So put a big number 9 in the middle of that clown's mouth that we can see there. Glossopharyngeal, cranial nerve number 9. This is another one that's mixed, a mixed one. So if you're doing any color coding, we would make our number 9 green as well, our mouth. Cranial nerve number 10 is called the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve. Remember, vagus means wandering. So this is the cranial nerve that basically goes everywhere. When you're looking at its description, it talks about stuff in the chest, it talks about stuff in the abdomen. So we're just going to say information from everywhere. That's my short synopsis of what it does. For our clown here, we are going to make some number 10 buttons that go down the front of his costume. Number 10 buttons, because the vagus nerve goes all the way down throughout its body. Cranial nerve number 10. This is another nerve that we would say is a mixed nerve. So it's collecting sensory information from all over the place. It is also doing some regulation of things like smooth muscle and cardiac muscle. This is another mixed nerve. Mixed nerve. We already wrote are 11, or we included it in our picture. Cranial nerve number 11 is called the accessory nerve. In this case, our clown is wearing a bow tie, an accessory. So the accessory nerve controls some of your neck muscles, in particular trapezius and sternocleidomastoid. So we're going to say neck muscles, or again, the way I like to remember it is places where an accessory would be on top of you. That's where the accessory nerve goes to. So I'm going to color in my bow tie. Oops, get my pencil here. My clown has a blue bow tie because that's my motor color. Cranial nerve number 11, accessory nerve. Last cranial nerve number 12, and this is the hypoglossal nerve. Its name literally means under tongue. Cranial nerve number 12 is found inside our number 9, or it's going to the muscles that are underneath the tongue. So I've got little number 12 there. Technically, cranial nerve number 12 is a motor nerve. So if we're color coding, we can put a little bit of blue inside the mouth of our clown here. This picture may or may not help you. If you are a visual studier, going through and practicing drawing this, I think could be very helpful for you. If you look at this and it brings you great anxiety, either because you hate clowns or because it's just not the way you learn, I'm not offended if you never make a clown again. But for any of my friends who like to have ways to study like this, that are maybe a little non-traditional, this is the way that I wish I had learned my cranial nerves rather than just memorizing them. So to give you a general idea of what each of these nerves do, you can see what part of the face they're going to, or what part of the body in the case of number 11 and 10. This gives you a general idea of where you find them going, what you find them doing. Thumbs up, thumbs down. How do we feel about functions on our cranial nerves? Barbara gave me a silly face, kind of like a clown. Check it out. There is a clown emoji. I'm liking that. Oh, good. Barbara says this is going to be helpful for her. Excellent. Yeah, I actually had a lot of students last semester that came back and said that the clown face was really helpful. Weird, but really helpful. I feel like that's a lot of the way that stuff goes in anatomy, right? Like, it's really weird, but it works. So if this crazy, creepy clown doesn't haunt you in your dreams, you haven't studied it enough, right? All right. With that, we are done with the ventricles, and we're done with the cranial nerves. I don't have a lot of time left, so I want to open the floor to have you all help me figure out what we want to discuss. I suspect that the top contenders for what we're most interested in are identifying muscles and predicting those muscle movements. Do you want to help me out in the chat? Where do we want to spend our last 20 minutes here? Or if there's something completely different you want to talk about, I am totally cool with that too. It's the bones of the arm, it's the muscles of the arm, it's those movement activities at the end. I'm happy to cover whatever we're interested in. Muscles are evil. Kaylin says the muscles are evil. Okay. Well, I've gotten 2 votes. They're both for muscles. I am happy to do muscles then. We'll do that, and then we'll see what time we have left. Okay. When we talk about the muscles, this is the week where Muscle Man is like evil to us, because Muscle Man is not in anatomical position. When we're in anatomical position, can you remind me what that looks like? What does anatomical position look like? or maybe a better question, what's wrong with Muscle Man? How is he not in anatomical position? I like that. Kaylin's calling him creepy Superman. I like that. Perfect. Yeah, so standing straight, your arms are at your side. Hey, there's one other thing about what's going on with your arms, or maybe in particular with your hands. Yeah, there we go. Kaylin mentioned having your palms facing up or facing forward. When you are looking at pictures in the guided lesson, or when you're doing a Google Images search, a lot of times they are going to give you the muscles when a person is in anatomical position. So we look at creepy Superman here. This arm is definitely not at his side, and this arm is definitely not palms facing forward. Here's the other view you have of creepy Superman this week. Neither of his arms are at his side. Neither of them have the palm facing forward. This week is going to be a week where it's really important for you to try to feel the general location of some of these muscles on your own body. If you know where they are on your own body, then you can turn your arm to the way that Muscle Man or creepy Superman is doing it. So when we're talking about muscles that we find on the anterior side of the forearm, so when we're talking about if you're in anatomical position, maybe here, let me see if I can find a good one really fast. Forearm muscles. Oh, look, it's in my recent search. Probably from last semester when I was working with students. Let's see. Oh, cool. Here, I got to show you something that I found that's not exactly what I was looking for, but it's really awesome. I suspect once it shares with you that this is going to be like the new way I teach this. Check this out. Okay, you got your arm out in anatomical position. Take your other hand and take those four fingers and lay it across your forearm. Your pinky represents flexor ulni or flexor carpi ulnaris. Your fourth finger, your ring finger, represents palmaris longus. And that middle finger represents flexor carpi radialis. We don't have to know pronator teres. We're not making you learn that this semester. But this is a good way if we can remember what these represent. This is a good way to think about where they are in your arm. When you're looking at them on a muscle man or a muscle picture, let me see if I can find a good one. Here, let's try again. Anterior arm muscles. Let's try this. We're just going to do anterior muscles. See what we get. These are not being helpful. Okay, well here, I'm going to go back to Muscle Man. I apologize. This wasn't as helpful as I thought it would be. I'm going to go back to Muscle Man and I'm going to show you what you're looking for on Muscle Man that will tell you every time where things are. So let's go back to Muscle Man, even though we hate him. You can pretend though, you know that rule we did with those four fingers? We can pretend that we're looking at Muscle Man this way. Every single time when you look at the anterior side of the forearm, the first muscle that you always want to find, the one that's going to be your reference point, is this one right here. Oh, I don't have my pointer on. Do I have my pointer on? Let's see. Come back. Okay, here we go. This one right here. See how this tendon goes all the way down into the palm of the hand. This muscle right here with the tendon that goes all the way into the palm of the hand, this is Palmaris longus. Palmaris longus. This is a muscle that goes down into the palm of your hand. When you tense up your hand to do like a little curl, so if you got a weight in your hand and you pull it up, that's Palmaris longus right there. So first thing you're looking for every time we see the anterior part of the forearm, find the muscle that goes all the way down into the palm of the hand. That's Palmaris Longus. Once you found Palmaris Longus, then we've got our two flexors. Now, both of these are flexor carpi, meaning they're going to flex the carpal bones. We've got radialis and we've got ulnaris. Hey, I promise this is not a trick question. Check this out. Here's my flexor carpi muscle that's over here on the pinky side of the hand. Do we think that it's radialis or ulnaris who lives on the pinky side? Yeah, look at that. We're all chiming in with ulnaris. We're 100% right. On the pinky side of Palmaris Longus, so here I should probably label that for us. Here's Palmaris. I'm just going to put its first name. Here's Palmaris that we find in the middle of the forearm. The one that's on the ulna side is flexor carpi ulnaris. I'm going to abbreviate. Flexor carpi ulnaris because it's on the side where the ulna is, which means that on the other side is flexor carpi radialis, on the thumb side where the radius is. I know that these names are super intimidating and the picture's not awesome, but if you can find Palmaris Longus, the one that goes all the way down into the palm, on the thumb side of it is the flexor carpi radialis. On the pinky side of it is flexor carpi ulnaris. When we get up into the arm itself up here, this is the muscle that's on the front side of your arm, and this is the muscle on the back side of your arm. Who lives on the front? Is the front biceps or triceps? Who's on the front side of your arm when you do a curl? Yeah, absolutely. Biceps brachii is the one that we see here closer to the face. Triceps brachii is the one that we're seeing on the back side or farther away. Okay, big idea with muscles. Palmaris Longus. Absolutely gotta know this one because then we can think our way through flexor carpi ulnaris on the ulna side, flexor carpi radialis on the radius side. Let's talk about muscles on the back side of the arm now. Now we're on the back side. Just like we had to know where Palmaris Longus was on the front side, the one we need to know on the back side is Extensor Digitorum. Extensor Digitorum. See this one right here that goes down into the digits? This big one here in the middle. Extensor Digitorum. So let me put his name up here. Extensor Digitorum. Okay. It's a little bit hard to pinpoint the exact locations of others. But here's our big idea here with our ones that live next door to it. Extensor Digitorum, when I'm on the pinky side of Extensor Digitorum, Extensor carpi, when I'm on the pinky side, is that going to be radialis or ulnaris on the pinky side? Yeah, Kira's voting ulnaris. There we go. Temiteo's voting it too. That is correct. On the pinky side, when you've got something pointing on the pinky side of Extensor Digitorum, this is Extensor carpi radialis. Or ulnaris, excuse me. When we're on the thumb side, that's Extensor carpi radialis on the radius side of the arm. We've still got our triceps here in the back and the biceps here in the front. Let me label these. Triceps. Oop, check my spelling. That was not great. Biceps. We can also see them, by the way, maybe a little bit more clearly on our other arm. So down here, we've got triceps in the back. I still can't spell triceps. Look at me. Biceps. And then we can see the big shoulder muscle right here, the deltoid muscle right here. The one that is new to us that we haven't seen before is this one called brachioradialis. Brachioradialis, its name means that it starts in the arm and it goes toward the radius. Brachioradialis. We can see this one best right here. Check out brachio on the arm, radialis toward the radius side. So brachioradialis, easiest to see right here. Brachioradialis. I think we hit all of the muscles. So I need to pause and let you all ask some questions or share some thoughts. What are we thinking? What's the trickiest? Give me some insight. Yeah, Kaylin says thank you. You're welcome. This is one of the trickier ones. I will be fully honest with you. The big trick with this, and it's where we started, was finding those big ones. So on this side, it was extensor digitorum. We can just, I hesitate to use this word, but it's kind of true. We can guess who lives on the other side as long as we can find either extensor digitorum or palmaris longus. So anytime we're asking you about a forearm muscle on the front or the back, always find extensor digitorum or always find palmaris longus. If you can find those, use your mad scientist skills to figure out if it's ulnaris or radialis. And hey, fun fact or an important study tool. Posterior forearm muscles are extensors. They're extensors. See how we're labeling the ones here on the back side? And it's extensor carpi radialis, extensor carpi ulnaris, and extensor digitorum. If you live on the back side, you are always an extensor. Anterior forearm muscles are flexors. Flexors. Spelled that wrong, but you get the idea. We had flexor carpi radialis and flexor carpi ulnaris. Anterior muscles, flexors. Posterior muscles, extensors. As long as we know where extensor digitorum is, as long as we know where palmaris longus is, we're in good shape to make our predictions. Unfortunately, I am sharing my home office today, and my husband has a meeting at 3. So this is probably all I can cover today. Are there any quick last-minute questions before we call it good for today? Edith's good. Timoteo's good. Yeah, you're welcome. It's been a little while, I feel like, since I gave you a penguin. So we'll do a penguin here in closing. Hey, instead of doing a creepy clown, we could have done like a creepy penguin. Although penguins are too sacred. We can't make them creepy, right? All right, well, you all have a great day as well. Please feel free to reach out via email with any questions that you have. We will start lesson number 10 tomorrow about neurons. We will try to wrap it up on Friday. So lots of neurons coming at you in lecture in the next couple of days. Don't forget about visible body, due on Friday. Have a great afternoon. Thank you all for coming, and I will see you again tomorrow.